Hi everyone, welcome back to Job 1 for All. In this video, we are going to talk about the finally block. Before we start talking about the finally block, let's create a new class and start with one small example. Since it's quite difficult to test this without knowing, for example, databases or how to work with files, we are just going to do a small simulation. So here at the runtime test, you can copy the runtime exception test02 and change the name. And we are going to reuse this method. So let's say here, let's imagine that we are working with a database, and the name of this method will be opening connection. Opening connection is quite weird. Open connection. Okay, and we are not going to have any parameters. Let's remove this. Let's remove this. Let's remove everything. And we're not going to return. Okay. So we have our try catch. And let's have here catching the exception, all the exceptions, and then we always print the stack trace. So now for our scenario. Usually when we are working with operating systems resources, or we are working with database resources, or even like API calls, you have to handle something that does not belong to you. So if you are opening, for example, a connection to the database, the Java itself is not the one responsible for opening that connection. It's going to rely usually on the vendor. So if you have MySQL, if you have Postgres, if you have Oracle, they will handle those connections for you, but they will open that connection and they will give that connection to your application, and it's up to you to use that connection wisely. And after you've finished using, you should close that connection. Why is that? Imagine that you deploy an application and suddenly, for any reason, for example, if you take a look at what happened to the Parler, because of one tweet, basically the application couldn't handle the flux of people just accessing at the same time. So this can happen, and the way you handle these resources may affect your entire application. Imagine, for example, that you have part of your application opening and closing files, writing files to the system, and the Java itself is not the one doing all the work. It needs to rely on the operating system. It is either Windows or Linux. They will have to like open resources, so your Java application will be able to work with files. And every time you do that, you have to be careful to close. So basically, you are borrowing some kind of resource, and after you finish using that resource, you have to close that resource. But the problem is sometimes you can have exceptions, and usually when you are working with resources that you need to close, they will throw some kind of checked exception. And we are going to do this simulation here. Imagine, for example, that you are opening connection, and after you open the connection, you, for example, is writing to the database, and after that you close the connection. So far you understand how try catch works. You have your try, and it was going to execute in this order. But what happens if on line 12 you have an exception? This line will never be executed. So you have a connection that's open and it will never be closed, because probably you will lose the reference to that object. And we have a bigger problem. If we have this in production and the issue is something that is not fixable, every user, like every connection, every object created will have an open connection hanging somewhere. And after some time, you can imagine what's going to happen. Your database and your application may crash. Now, the solution, the ugly one, would be, yeah, you just duplicate. And when you are duplicating, it's probably something that's bad. The option that we have here is something that could help us executing no matter what, no matter if it's successfully created, no matter if we have an exception, no matter if we are returning something, we always want that block of code to be executed. And we have what we call finally. So the finally block is a piece of block after the try catch that will always be executed. It's a guarantee that Java is giving you that this block will be executed. So now the close connection should be here. Imagine that this is a really complex code. No, not complex. You are just closing, but imagine that it's more complex than this we have here. And we're going to call open connection. Now, when you execute, you will notice that we have opening connection, writing to the database, and then we closed. And if we have like an exception, throw new runtime exception, you will notice that we have opening, writing, and then we have the connection closed, the code at least was executed, and then only then we have our catch print stack trace being executed. So we had the happy scenario, the not so happy scenario, and in both scenarios, this piece of code was executed. Now, what happens if we have to return something? Let's say that we have to return a string. So return connected, or at the end, because if we have try catch and finally, return not connected. So just as a small example, when we execute, you will notice that we have opening connection, writing to the database, and even though we have a return here, the finally is executed. So if we have a breakpoint here and we press Shift F9, if we press F8, then you have the return, and after that, instead of returning to the caller, we have the finally being executed. And the same thing happens in case we have, let me see here, throw new runtime exception. Well, I'm doing this because if I remove, we will have unreachable statement. Okay, now we have this return, and we have finally, and we have this return that should be the one returned in case we have any exceptions before the line 15. So by executing Shift F9, we'll add another breakpoint here. So we have the try being executed, then F8, we have the exception, and as you can see, we have the catch, and we have the finally being executed, and after that, we have our return. So the order that they are actually happening is not that important unless you are studying for the certification. But in general, what you need to remember about the finally is that it will be executed no matter what. And another interesting thing is about the structure of the try catch. So you have try, and we were working with try catch always, and now we have try catch finally. The try, it can never be by itself. So for example, let me return this to void and remove this to keep it clean. So you can never write try direct like this. You can have like try catch, or you can have try finally. So basically, that's another option that Java is giving to you. And honestly, in my whole career, I never saw that in production code, but there are some uses. So for example, imagine that you are opening the connection, but for some reason you don't want or you cannot handle the exception in this piece of code. But if you are opening the connection here, you should also close the connection here. So in this case, it would make sense. But even though I never saw like a try finally in my career without having the catch in between. But the syntax is possible, and you should know that this exists and it's completely valid. But this is the most likely scenario. So to wrap up this class, what I have to remember is that the finally will always be executed. The try can be either with try catch and finally, try catch, or try finally. And finally, is usually used when you have to close resources or have a piece of code that must be executed. Either you have the help flow or you have an exception in your flow. So that's it. Let's continue with more exceptions in the next video. See you there. Bye.